Hey everyone, it's Jeff from Programmer vs. World. Today we're going to start a multi-part tutorial, which is basically building an application in Apache Sling. I came up with the idea a few days ago thinking how I was going to put these tutorials together in a way where they would actually make some sense. And I figured that we'd just start off by building an app. And for an application, actually what I want to do is create basically a podcast application that holds maybe multiple podcasts that you run. Each one of those has multiple episodes in it, and each one of the episodes have a link to be able to play it, or would also be able to use the same app to generate an RSS feed for it. That way we could put it into, iTunes, Podcast Connect, and all the other services that are out there. It's not necessarily something that's this really grave original idea, but it is something to get us started nonetheless. So to kick the thing off, I'm going to move kind of fast through most of these parts because we covered this kind of in the first tutorial. I'm going to go ahead and start up Apache Sling. And then once I actually see the 8080 fly by there, I'm going to check my installation here. It takes it a minute or two. And then I'm going to log in as admin, and I'm sitting on Apache Sling, a base install. So I started this all over again. And the reason I did that is I wanted to show you how to start a project off from scratch. And in this project, all I'm really going to do, or in this tutorial rather, all I'm really going to do is start a completely new project, remove the example data. We'll snap in bootstrap, we'll create a couple nodes, and then we'll create a renderer for it, and then we'll call it. My first time through this last night, it went for about 35 minutes, and I don't want to go that long on the first one. So part one is just us setting up the project. So we'll start up Eclipse. I'm going to have to build a new workspace for this since I already have last night's work sitting over there on that one. Long and comfortable pause. Here we go. All right, okay. So once it's initialized, I go ahead and get out of that, and I do my standard. I move the JCR window over here. I turn around and I make sure that my server view is on here. And I usually drag it right there. Okay, so we're gonna go File, New Project. We're gonna pick Sling. We're gonna use the content project for this. We'll call this Podcast App. We're gonna have to set up a new server. It's not gonna detect the one that I started up externally over here. So we'll say set up new server. All this really is I'll just call it Jeff server because it is. So this is just a running instance of Sling sitting over here on localhost 8080 admin, the whole 9 yards. It shouldn't be anything big to actually get that. We can see that it went ahead and connected. Remember, started just means that it connected to the Sling instance that's running over here. And our content project automatically gave us this example item content node and this guy right here. We're not going to use either one of them. As a matter of fact, is this going to try to open? Let me fix this real fast, guys. So I don't know if you know this or not, but if you have a JSP file or something and it doesn't want to open in the appropriate editor, you can always force it to open in the appropriate editor. And when this content type preferences warning comes up, you can turn around and say, like any file that's JSP, I actually want you to open with whatever the HTML editor is instead. And then we'll actually get this editor. That was mostly for naught though, because we're actually going to take this apps example directory. I'm going to right click it and just delete it. Don't delete the apps folder now, just the example folder. And in this folder as well, actually before I delete it, let me go into my filters and turn that on, or take the dot resources and uncheck it. Okay. So then we're going to right click the example folder and just delete it. So now I have a project with absolutely nothing in it except a content folder and a content XML, which is this guy right here, and an apps folder that has nothing else in it. And that's exactly where we want to start. This is like the de facto start point of a base project. So what should we do first? Let's put the node in first. But before we do that, let me show you kind of how I'm thinking the nodes are going to get laid out. Now, since Apache Oak is basically a tree-like structure, I thought the easiest way to show you what I was thinking was to actually just create some blank folders to show you. So I'm thinking about having a root node or a content node of podcast, and inside there it holds every single one of the episodes or every single one of the podcasts that you want to manage inside of it, and it can have as many as you want. Inside each podcast will be each one of the episodes, and inside each episode will be some details and maybe a way to play it. And this gives us about a 4 deep hierarchy of 4 different renderers that we would need to build in Apache Sling to do it. So I'm just going to start with podcasts today. The future tutorials will go further down the road. As a matter of fact, the second one, we won't even add multiple podcasts into this folder probably until, or at least render them until the second one. We'll add them today, but we won't really do anything with them. Today, we just want to get the podcast page to show us something. And then we want to snap in Bootstrap, jQuery, and well, that's pretty much it. Bootstrap and jQuery so that we can start building upon that. I want to show you how to do that before we leave today. So let's keep moving. I'm going to kind of keep going really fast. So in order to do that, we need to go into our content directory, and we'll create a new folder, and we'll call it podcast. Now remember, we need a content XML declaration, just like a content folder has in every single folder that we create. And the easiest way to do this is just to, I like to take that out. It's just to right click this guy and say copy, go into the podcast folder and say paste. And now we actually have it in there. It's not going to be on our server yet because we still need to go into the meta-inf, into the vault folder, go to filter XML and change this filter root to be content podcasts and hit save on that. While we're here, let's go ahead and change apps to components, and I'll show you why we do that here in a minute. All right, so now both our filter roots are done. We shouldn't have to come back in here again. Now, if we go into our podcast folder, into our content XML file, and just add a space or a carriage return, hit the save button, we should now be able to, let me go up here to the URL bar, we'll put in the word content. And remember, we can put .json at any time we want to see a specific node, but if we want to drill down further, we have to tell it how far to go. And in this case, we told it to go up to 4 levels deep, and we can see that podcast, sure enough, is sitting at the next level underneath content. And we can take that even further on our URL if we just say, okay, after content, let's put the word podcasts, and there we go, there is a node underneath it. So we know that this deployment worked just fine. So in the podcast folder, we're going to add 2 more folders. I'm going to add podcast number 1. Should we do this all caps? Let's don't capitalize it. Podcast 1. And I'm going to add another one called podcast 2. All right, we'll just put a couple in there. I'm going to take this content XML. I'm going to paste it in both. Right, so we can see it in there. Now, if I refresh this guy, we'll see that there's 2 podcasts underneath the podcast folder. So we pretty much have this hierarchy going where we have these 2 guys. We don't really need this guy anymore. And that's kind of what we look like right now. And that's fine. That's going to be the end of that for this tutorial. What we want to do, though, is at least create one node so that if we go to podcasts right here where we are and type .html, we actually get something. And not this message. Remember, this message is the HTML render servlet, which is the default, telling us that it couldn't find any specific renderers or resource types in the actual node. So what it did by default was it just piped everything to this servlet, so it would just give you a bunch of information. It was better this than an error message. Get really used to the screen. It helps a lot in troubleshooting to know that when this screen came up, all it really meant was, hey, I couldn't find anything to render it. So let's solve this problem right now. If we go into the apps folder, remember in our vault filter config, we said apps components and not apps podcast. And I did that for a reason. So in our apps folder, we don't need to create content XMLs here. We can just say apps components. We'll make it 1 deep, and inside components, we'll create one and call it podcasts. Now, this components folder that I'm putting everything underneath is really just a little hack so that later when you move to Adobe AEM or Adobe CQ, you'll already be familiar with that folder and what's usually inside of it. There's not too many parallels that I'm going to draw from this point forward because there's other stuff in CQ, like there's a templates and a pages section, and there's all kinds of weirdness in there. basically, those were just ways of organizing stuff inside their system. And for those of you that don't know what AEM or CQ is, it's basically a huge enterprise scale CMS that's built on top of Sling. But we're getting off target. So in the components in the podcast directory, I want you to create a new file. And it's going to seem dumb at the time, but just stay with me. We're going to call it html.html. Okay. Now we actually have a file inside there called html.html. Let's just add a single header and go, this is the podcast's renderer. All right. And we'll save that away. Now, I want to make sure that this is there before we get too carried away. So I can actually, without the caps lock on, go to apps, components, podcast. You can tell I've done this before, right? Apps, components, podcasts, HTML.html, and actually see it. So it actually is there. But that's not what we're after to do. What we want to do is render podcasts from our content to use this renderer whenever that node's hit. So the way we do that is we have to go into the podcast folder, take its content into or content XML, and give it a resource type so that the system can find it. And the way we do that is we add a new attribute called sling:"resource type. And we set it to basically the path to get to that folder from the root, but there's a trick to this. If we were really trying to do this from the root, we would say like apps, components, podcasts, and we'd stop there. We don't put the html.html. But the way Sling works is it automatically assumes this is the case. So all it really needs from you is components/podcast into it. That translates as to go into the apps folder, go into components podcast, and try to find the first selector that matches. In our case, we're not doing anything really crazy with the selectors. So that when we put .html on the end of it, it should find the left-hand side of this file name. It should match on this. The right side of this file name is telling the system what kind of template engine is actually rendering the content. So let's see if our example works. And it does not. Components/podcast HTML actually is there. Did we save this node? Is there a misspelling? I'm sorry, guys. I'm just quick troubleshooting right here. And it's trying to tell us there's no resource type on the node. So what did we do? Did we put it on the wrong guy? Yes. Where did we end up putting that? Okay, we put that on the actual content folder. And this is a good point. It will get confusing in here manipulating these content XML files. So just be aware that sometimes these indentations on these directories isn't usually enough for you to make sense of it. So we're just going to cut that out of there. Okay, we'll go into this content XML and get it right this time. It happens. Then we'll come in here and refresh, and then we'll actually see that renderer is there. Now, we can do a couple things to prove that this actually is rendering in the right context. We can come in here and actually give this a title, a JCR : title. You can actually create attributes out of anything that you want inside here, by the way. You're not stuck to doing just what I'm doing, but this is the podcast listing. We'll put that in as the title, and then as a description, we'll say, no, really, this is the podcast listing. Okay, we'll just give it some extra attributes. Now, it won't change anything right off the bat, but now we'll notice if we actually go into our renderer, and instead of the title we put here, well, let's talk for a minute before we go this far. This looks like it's just HTML, and it will seem to you that all that will ever be able to be written in here is just raw HTML, so it won't be really that useful. But that's not 100% accurate. In Sling 8, the .html extension does mean HTML, but it also means using Sightly templating. And to understand a little bit more about what Sightly is, there's some good bookmarks that you probably need to have. If you actually Google the term Sightly GitHub, which I recommend you do, the first hit in it will actually be the Adobe Marketing Cloud's GitHub site. And inside here, you'll see that there is a link to the specification. And Sightly is actually an HTML templating language that's incredibly powerful. But what it essentially, in a nutshell, what it lets you do is not break out of the tags of HTML in order to do some pretty powerful stuff when it comes to manipulation. So if we look down here, it's like, how can we actually insert things into the actual document? We notice that there's a syntax that basically says, oh, well, if you want to get like the properties title in the context of HTML, which we won't actually do right now, but this is basically the tag to do it. So we say, okay, so that means it's possible for us to do things like, and actually get the title to come into that H1. Let's see if that worked. Yep. So when we get, this is the podcast listing. So don't stop there. Let's actually go into paragraph here. And we'll say properties. Whoops. Yeah, that's right. JCR description. Sorry, guys. It's this little Mac keyboard drives me crazy. No, really, this is the podcast listing. So this information is actually still coming from this content node where we put it in. Then we can test that. If we just like take that out and change it to list or something, we can actually refresh and see that we're actually getting that. Okay, so now we got the renderer working. You may actually wonder what would happen if we went back to, this is a fun experiment, I get this question a lot. If we went back to the apps folder directly and went straight to that HTML, and the answer is, you would get something that looks like that, because the apps directory is going to be taken literally. It's not going to apply any specific resource context to it unless it renders from a node somewhere else. So someone who tries to navigate directly to this is not going to be able to use the application. The only way it can be used is from the content perspective. Now, there are some ways to get around this with includes and other stuff, which we are going to do, but just know that if you go back to there where before we actually had a message, now you're actually going to see those tags literally. But when it renders from a content node, you're actually going to see the values out of it. Okay, so we have this set up, but before we can go any further, we really need to create some place to put style sheets and JavaScript files so that we can snap in Bootstrap and jQuery, and we can get this tutorial wrapped up. In order to do that, I'm going to go to the JCR root and I'm going to create a completely new folder. Now, this is not necessarily the mandatory way to do it. This is just the way I do it out of habit. And it may actually be dumb compared to some of the developers you'll hear comment on it later, but this is just the way I do it, so bear with me. I create a folder called static under the JCR root. And inside this folder, I actually create a CSS folder. And I create a JavaScript folder. Sometimes I even create an images folder, but that's kind of silly in our context. And remember, we want these all to be folders, so we can actually borrow this content XML that just says it's just a folder. Notice there's no other attributes in there. That's what I was checking for. And we can, paste this in and actually create 3 new folders here. And we can go into our vault now and go into the filter XML. Whoops. Boy, that was a helpy highlight right there. And then go into filter root static. Go just like that. And now our root node of static will also get pushed on our deployments. And just to make sure, we'll add a space to this guy. We'll go into static. Tidy4JSONs look good. It didn't look like we actually got anything pushed that time. There we go. So the CSS, I just added a space to the content XML and then resaved it again just to trick it into reloading. I know it's a hack and there probably is a better way, but for some reason on this computer, if you like right click a node and say Sling import from server, mine won't actually work. Something with this PC, I'm sure, or my install. Anyway, so we have static now and we have a CSS folder and we have a JavaScript folder, and we can double check that. So I'm going to go back and do this number. So with both those folders open, basically I already have my stuff pre-downloaded. So like Bootstrap is right here. We can go into the CSS of Bootstrap and take the min CSS right from it and just drop it right on top of that folder and say copy. We want to get that JavaScript file out of there too, the min.js. Okay, and I also have jQuery right here, 112. So I'm going to go ahead and drop it into the JavaScript as well. And while we were doing that, now if you refresh, you'll notice those files are actually in there. You'll also notice that they're treated just like nodes in the hierarchy. They just have a specific type of NT file and not Sling folder. And there's a content node on the inside of it where the actual file's being held. We can validate that these files are actually here by following that hierarchy. We can say CSS bootstrap min CSS, and there it is. Okay, so now that they're there, we can actually pull them into our HTML here. And I'm going to have to write this by hand and try to be rather quick about it, which is always a recipe for disaster. But we can actually start creating, HTML lang equal, trying to be proper here, en. We can go into create a head, create a title. This is the beginning. We'll put a body in right here. Man, my home row was way off on that one. Let's take both these guys and put them in the body for now. We're going to clean all this up in the next tutorial. Don't worry about it. And let's hit save on that. Okay, so there it is. And now we just need to put our, I know that's probably not valid, and I do it every time. So our Bootstrap min CSS is sitting right here in the project, so we can actually access this normally. There's no trick to it. So be static CSS Bootstrap min CSS. And if we save that now and refresh our project, we'll notice that this whole font changed and it's now looking all bootstrappy, which is exactly what we want. And then we want script source equal static JavaScript jQuery -1-12-1-min.js. All right, the easiest way I know to check that is to hit function F12 on this crazy, okay, forget that. See, developer tools, we'll go to the console, somehow edit that dog bark out, refresh, no errors. But if we look at this guy, he actually exists. All right, so we have jQuery snapped in. The last step, of course, is to just, I'm doing this the hard way. I don't know why I just don't copy this over. I feel like you have to have baby fingers in order to be able to use these mini Mac keyboards. Bootstrap min.js. Now, if all of this is right, we won't get that goofy error that says bootstrap. All right, so we won't get the goofy error that says jQuery is needed. And if we check, jQuery is actually there. If we look at the page source, we'll see that those imports work just fine, and that looks pretty much exactly like we said it was going to look. And that's pretty much where we're going to stop. So basically, what have we done? Well, we have one node hooked up already to a renderer. We're using the Sightly templating engine, or at least getting used to it. We now know where to go to get that information, and we're at a perfect place to start development. We have Bootstrap and jQuery available to us, which we are going to need. And that's pretty much the best stopping point I could hope for in this tutorial. In the next one, we're going to start cleaning up this HTML, and we're going to create headers and footers. We're going to start experimenting with the Sightly templating language and how to cut this up into a template, and then use the list and repeat things so that we can actually display all of the podcasts that we're going to create into the podcast directory, which we haven't necessarily done yet. So for now, I guess it's au revoir. I'm Jeff from Programmer vs. World, and I'll see you guys in part 2.